If you've been playing Diablo IV and have kept up with any form of discussion, you likely know that one of the biggest points of contention right now is the dungeon grinding experience with a big focus on XP and mob density, with the hardcore race to 100 plus people such as myself just genuinely wanting to reach the max level. There was an inevitable rise of popularity to specific dungeons to grind in order to maximize earned XP. If you don't know what I'm talking about, here's a rundown of some of the best XP focused dungeons since release. Champion's Demise is a 3-lane map that boasts multiple elite packs in each lane, making it an effective farming method for 3 to 4 man groups as well as solo players. Each lane led to a room where you need to retrieve a key item to return to the center before you're able to fight the boss. Malgon's Works was an overtuned but highly rewarding dungeon with tripled elite spawns, leading to an overwhelming number of elites per pack, meaning an overwhelming amount of XP. This dungeon requires you to free some prisoners before heading to the boss. Ironhold was similar, with the second half of the map containing the overtuned elite packs similar to Malgon's Works for a fat hit of XP. In order to progress in this dungeon, you need to kill a specific mob for a key and then retrieve 2 bloodstones to open the boss door. The most recent XP Goliath was Ruins of Eridu, my beloved. This dungeon was sublime, consisting of a static twin loop with a simple kill-all objective that would spawn packs of elite plus regular mobs every set amount of kills. The rest of the dungeon could be skipped and reset, with the first portion of the dungeon being the focus. Now let's break this whole debacle down into specific topics that we'll focus on, namely gameplay, speed, the alternatives, and the future. The objectives are important to note in the dungeons that I mentioned, as these are always set in stone for every single dungeon. You'll never have a switch up for as long as the dungeon exists. Some of them have randomized layouts with some consistent bits, and others like Champion's Demise and the first parts of Ruins of Eridu are identical. But ultimately, those who seek out these dungeons for the purpose of leveling will be stuck in an endless loop without any variety. These dungeons have all been altered by Blizzard through recent updates, specifically by nerfing the number of mobs with the priority being the elites. The most recent patch notes have a developer's note stating, "We are standardizing the density of elite monsters that spawn in dungeons to ensure that no particular dungeon is clearly more efficient to run through than others." Ignoring the fact that this actually means that they gutted overall pack density across the board, this means every dungeon should pump out the same amount of XP as others, right? Not necessarily. People value their time, so finding the most XP within the shortest amount of time is typically the goal. If I can get 20 million XP per hour in one dungeon versus 19 million per hour at the runner-up dungeon, why would I ever choose the latter? Ruins of Eridu was near perfect for the XP grind. No objective to really focus on, just kill the mobs, get your XP and loot, and then reset. The mobs were in a small area with dense packs, which meant the action was non-stop. You walk for maybe 3 to 5 seconds before you reach another cluster of mobs on the other side. It took the average knowledgeable player with a sufficient build about 1.5 to 2 minutes inside the dungeon, all spent fighting and briefly looting. It was gameplay. Something that plagues many of Diablo IV's dungeons is downtime. Champion's Demise shows an extreme case, with you having to backtrack from the spot where you grab the key items all the way back to the center, then start down another lane. However, the dungeon is uniquely formatted, and therefore I can kind of excuse it. But other dungeons have shorter but still sort of unnecessary downtime from pack to pack, and it doesn't really feel all too great. It's not the end of the world, but the fun aspect of ARPGs, at least to me, is killing hordes of enemies to get loot and become stronger and then kill bigger, stronger hordes. Tack on the fact that they aim to standardize elite density so that one map shouldn't necessarily have more elites than another, then why would you ever pick a dungeon that takes any longer to complete in order to get your kills and therefore your XP and loot? Or matter of fact, why not just tackle some alternative content in the game instead? There are benefits to running each dungeon in the game, that being their respective aspects, unlocking in the codex, obtaining renown, and moment-to-moment variety. Nightmare dungeons don't actually switch up the formula all too much outside of making runs take longer, individual mobs providing more XP as long as they're leveled higher than the player, and allowing the leveling of glyphs. But the rewards don't actually add up all too much, and glyphs can get levels and then be forgotten about past a certain point for casual gameplay. Mob density doesn't increase, new objectives aren't added, there are few positive changes between the Nightmare dungeon and its normal counterpart. No other content in the game has comparable XP, even Helltides in Tier 4. However, other content has their own focuses, like Helltides can help target farm equipment, plus its own exclusive materials for crafting. Nightmare dungeons have the glyph leveling, and the Tree of Whispers tries its best. Back to Ruins of Eridu. This is a dungeon that is not on the Nightmare dungeon list, meaning you can only run it normally. However, I could pump out a level in the 90s in around an hour time pretty consistently. Nightmare dungeons can provide more XP per mob at the cost of having tankier mobs due to level, modifiers that could slow me down further, and being random dungeons that may or may not be good in terms of length and objectives. You do have a bit of control on that last part, but there's very few dungeons that can compare to the speed of Ruins of Eridu or Champion's Demise with the party members that can handle their own lanes. One thing that I found myself repeating in my head with the reduced mob count in some of these dungeons was that this feels violently more like an MMO, which I was already saying prior, but now with sparse mobs, it feels like I'm supposed to grab aggro and then train multiple mob packs together like I'm tanking a Final Fantasy XIV or something. There are solutions, and I think people have been blasting them loud enough that it's just reaching deaf ears at this point. The solution I agree with is matching mob density across other dungeons to match that of the commonly farmed dungeons, which is a net gain. They could set some sort of internal grading system for every dungeon based on an average time to run, and then they can scale the XP per mob and the total XP you could get from the map to match that amount based on the grade. Longer dungeons will therefore provide more XP to compensate for time spent, meaning that if you skip the mobs won't hurt for the sake of trying to get through it all, and shorter dungeons won't match that total XP that a longer dungeon can give, but they're going to be faster, which is useful for people who are short on time, or they decide to pick that dungeon for the Whispers, or they just like how it's formatted. They get the compromise of getting less XP, but they might be able to squeeze in an extra run or two. However, in the end, you'll still get a dense, action-filled dungeon run from start to finish with that increased mob density. This would also promote less of a focus on the dungeon itself for Nightmare dungeon choices and put more emphasis on the modifiers presented on the sigil. Then they gotta slap on a thick buff to Nightmare dungeon completion XP, and that'll raise the appeal over regular dungeons, as well as for those who don't care about glyphs as much. Also, they should get rid of the magic find as a modifier and just apply that to every sigil with an increasing effect as you increase the tiers. I feel like that just makes more sense instead of just always having to pray for a magic find to be on a sigil. There's obviously going to be shortcomings in this idea, as with any solution, but Blizzard's current direction is doing much more harm to player enjoyment as it seems to be very nerf heavy. I'm sure there is a crowd that likes a slower paced game, but that seems like a vision that would have led to the game releasing in an entirely different state in the first place, instead of being something that needed frequent nerfs to get to. This isn't Blizzard's first rodeo. But I don't know, I'm not a game designer, I just play them. Let me know what you think down below. Let's get this discussion going. This is something that's a lot of back and forth in the community, but I think there's a very vocal majority even that agrees that at least nerfing mob density is not the direction to go. And if anything, bring up the mob count, lower the per mob XP if they need to. That way, people get a lot more action, get a lot more gameplay going instead of having to kill a pack of 5 enemies and then run 10 seconds down the way to find another 5 enemies or so. And on that note, I'll see you guys in the next one.